Why do we educate young people? Currently, the answer to that question is to meet the manpower needs of industry and economic needs of societies. Consequently, it is industry that determines the nature and focus of educational systems. This is the approach to education challenged by the late Sir Ken Robinson when he said, "The more complex the world becomes, the more creative we need to be to meet its challenges." Education is to help each individual reach their potential in whatever field brings them joy, to teach people how to learn and equip them for lifelong learning, and to develop people into citizens and workers who can contribute to society. Right, let's meet our panel of experts. Professor Malcolm McIver, CEO and Provost at Lancaster University in Ghana. Professor Seth Kunin, Deputy Vice-Chancellor International at Curtin University in Perth. Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. Professor Zebulon Vilakazi, Vice-Chancellor and Principal at the University of the Witwatersrand. The moderator is Gugulethu Mfupi, broadcaster and financial journalist. Well, a very good morning to each and every one of you once again, and thank you so much not only for joining us on our live platform on Hop In, but also for joining us on CNBC Africa channel 410. Again, thank you to Zinati as well for giving us an overview and the introduction to today's conversation, which really does set the foundation of the overriding theme that we look to unpack here this morning in terms of how best do we redefine the purpose and the role and function of education, but also how do we make sure that the purpose of education for the 21st century is adequately identified. While in light of the recent pandemic, how this has shifted the narrative to more digital resources for learning, and of course understanding the major challenges and inequalities that in most markets have been exacerbated by the lack of resources, lack of adequate opportunities that are available to many participants. These just set the theme and the context and a few ideas that we will venture into in conversation over the next 40 minutes with my panelists. While the introductions have been done, and I'm quite excited to speak and to welcome all our panelists on screen, Professor McIver, Professor Kunin, Professor Phakeng, and Professor Vilakazi. A very good morning to each and every one of you this morning, and thank you so much for making time to join us. And I guess perhaps to get into the conversation and respond to many of the questions that have been raised and themes and concepts that we want to dive into, perhaps we need to start by getting a clear understanding of what the purpose of education within the 21st century really is, taking into consideration the many and multitude of challenges but opportunities that also remain in this market. I'd like to commence the opening remarks, perhaps by starting with yourself, Professor McIver. Following that, we'll be sure to get some feedback from your colleagues, following Professor Kunin and Professor Phakeng and Professor Vilakazi. If you could provide us as well with your perspective in that order of your thoughts and themes that you hope to see being prevalent as we define the purpose of education in the 21st century. Professor McIver, the floor is yours. Prof, I think we do need to go back to the rules of 2020 that many of us have gotten quite comfortable with. The proverbial, your mic is on mute, is, I guess, an indicator of the fact that we can't hear you today. But as soon as you start peaking, I'll give you a thumbs up as soon as your audio is clear.
Is my audio clear now, Guru? Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Professor McIver. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think before looking at where we are in the 21st century, it would make sense to actually put it into context. And if you'll forgive me, sounding like an academic, maybe starting with a little bit of a history lesson and explaining how we got to where we are now. And if you look at the history of education, pre-industrial revolution, there was two dominant models that were in place. The first was the elitist model, in which education was very much the preserve of the rich and the religious organizations, the churches, the monasteries. At that time, education was very much learning for the sake of learning. The alternative model, the one that applied to the vast majority of people, was the communal model, in which young people were taught by the community in which they lived. The community taught them their values, they taught them the rules, the regulations, and they also taught them the skills that were necessary to support and maintain the community. So those were the two traditional models pre-industrial revolution. Post-industrial revolution, what happened was education changed and it became available to the masses. But education adopted the industry model. And with the industry model, it was very much about preparing people for the workplace. And that model has remained dominant pretty much ever since. So that's where we are at this moment in time. We have an education system worldwide that is geared up towards preparing people for the workplace. As we move forward further into the 21st century, I would contend we need to move away from this mass production, industrialized model of education and move to a more personalized model of education. You made reference to Sir Ken Robinson earlier on, and I'm a big fan of his work. And Sir Ken talked very much about personalizing education. One of the things he identifies in one of his famous TED Talks is that wherever you go in the world, you will see the same hierarchy of subjects. First place is always STEM, science, technology, mathematics. Second place will be humanities, and third place will be arts. And this is where the funding invariably goes towards those subjects according to that hierarchy. And it makes no difference whether you're studying in Africa, in America, or Europe, that hierarchy remains. Sorry, excuse me. I would contend we need to move away from that. We need to make it more personalized. And by personalized, what I mean is the consumers themselves, the primary stakeholders, should have more control over the direction of education. When we talk about stakeholders these days, we do talk about students, we do talk about parents, we talk about academics, and we talk about industry and government. The reality is that it's an uneven playing field. It's governments and industry who determine what the educational model is going to be. It's governments and industry who will determine what subjects are taught, the hierarchy I referred to earlier on. And in doing so, we actually squeeze out the creativity that Sir Ken Robinson is so keen to say. I would argue that the only way we can get that creativity back is by empowering the primary stakeholders and having bespoke education. And I think digitalization will enable us to do that.
Professor, I'm going to ask you to pause it there because you've certainly helped us to identify and obviously reflect on the history, but of course, very key and pertinent elements that you've highlighted, and I do want us to expand on them in just a moment, primarily going back to creativity and of course, as you mentioned, allowing the primary stakeholders to participate in the development and evolution of education as we need it in the 21st century. But Professor Coonan, I'm keen to get your thoughts here as we do reflect on the purpose of education in the 21st century. What are your ideas, and perhaps are some of them echoing the sentiments of Professor McIver in terms of going back to basics and creativity and moving away from the industrialization model?
I think I would agree with Professor McIver absolutely that what we need to do is move to a much more personalized form of education that focuses on starting with the individual student and where they want to go, what they want to be, and what they want to do. But just to be clear, I think what it will consist of is a number of different ways that education in universities has always tried to be. So I think the idea that we will move totally away from the idea that education is about preparing people to do different types of work, to prepare them for the workplace, I think that's not going to vanish, but it shouldn't be the only driver. It's one driver, and many students will look to that driver. A second driver is the one which has also gone alongside the industrial one, which is to say that education is about preparing students to be active and engaged citizens. It's preparing them to be challenging. It's preparing them to ask the right questions. It's preparing them to be creative in how they wish to think and act in the world. And I think that that's an important part of education as well. And I think it's increasingly important because there's a truism which may not be true, which says that in the next, students of today will have, many different jobs and will need to be prepared for many different types of careers and different skill sets. And that may be true, but let's assume that it is. How do we as a university prepare students to be able to make that kind of life journey? And we prepare them by giving them the skills to be able to engage with the ideas, to be able to engage with the different subjects that they're studying so that they can always move beyond them. So it's not teaching them a narrow skill set, assuming that that's going to be the only skill set that they always will need. It's teaching them skills to be able to understand that skill set, to be able to develop that skill set, and to be able to move beyond that skill set. So I think that that's fundamental. And I think there's one other element that needs to be thought about. Education does have an instrumental aspect, but it also has a transformational aspect. And I think that this is particularly found in the humanities and the arts, which often are seen as the stepchildren in universities. But it misses the fact that these are precisely the disciplines that allow people to make meaning. These are the disciplines that allow people to look at their lives, to make them meaningful, to find beauty and creativity. And we need to recognize that as people move through their lives, they're going to need that skill set as well as the other skill sets I've mentioned. The humanities are an important aspect in understanding what it means to be human and allowing us to act within that world. So
a perfect point there, Professor Kuhnen, as you mentioned, showing us and reminding us how best to be human even though we adapt to the environment that we're in. I am mindful of time and of course would like to get your comments and feedback as well as our audience members and participants. So if you do have any questions, do be sure to put them into the chat service, as we would like to engage and hear your thoughts on that too. But Professor Phakeng, I'm also keen to hear your thoughts and insights as we continue with our opening remarks regarding the repurposing of education in the 21st century. We clearly understand, going back to the mandate of personalization, which has been mentioned by some of your colleagues, and of course education being an evolution and transformational. But what are your thoughts in terms of education in the 21st century, and specifically if we could angle this within the African context? Professor Phakeng?
Very much. I mean, I want to start by saying I understand the idea and the common understanding that the current purpose of education is to meet manpower needs of industry and economic needs of societies. And I think it is safe to say that for us at UCT, that we have never subscribed to that purpose. Certainly not for higher education, but also not for basic education. So I'm moving from that premise. I'll talk later about personalized education because I think there's a step before that. We cannot even say we can offer personalized education before we can even offer personalized pacing within the classrooms that we have. But let me then ask, so why do we educate? I mean, for us, we educate to advance the human condition and push the limits of the human mind with collective minds. And that's some of what Seth talked about. And Malcolm also alluded to that. We educate to nurture the hopes of the world. We do that by engaging our students into solving challenges that cross borders, in unlocking and harnessing new knowledge, in building cultural, political understanding, and in new knowledge, or in modeling environments and promoting dialogue and debates. And let me say that the subjects, the disciplines that do this, I mean, oftentimes when we talk about building cultural and political understanding, the immediate easy way to go to is only humanities does that. Well, not really. There's a lot of politics and culture in mathematics, right? So we don't want to argue that. And I want to say it is about what mathematics you teach and how you teach it. So at best, education does more than prepare you just for your first job. It helps you anticipate and perhaps even create your fourth and fifth job, a job that may not even exist now. So to address the challenges that Africa is currently facing around unemployment, we need to be creating not just workers or employees, but also employers, innovators, inventors, entrepreneurs the people who can help create the new sectors that will improve lives in Africa, and also to help plug the brain drain by creating platforms where educated and skilled workers can develop their potential. Mm-hmm. But as I was thinking about this question, I thought, why is it such a worry? Why are there concerns about the relevance of education today? Why is it? I mean, it's been there, but it's growing. And I think, first of all, I think of course the pandemic did us a favor, disrupted a lot of us in the education sector in particular, and everyone was forced to think about it if they were not thinking about it already. But listen, if truth be told, this question is also relevant because politicians want universities to justify the large sums of money invested in them by contributing solutions to society's urgent problems: poverty, eradication of poverty, service delivery, and so on, and we can go on. And industry is concerned about the quality and employability of university graduates and relevance of their research. And business also is concerned, and so there's concern everywhere. And we've got to understand this in context. And I think sometimes there can be a lost in translation kind of conversation if we don't say, but why is it an issue now? Because it's not just about changing, it's also to understand why is this the case. I would like, of course, as I said, I will talk about personalized pacing within classrooms. And I said, we believe that education, both at basic education and higher education, is not just for employment. Of course, we're breaking boundaries, as you know, with the online high school is part of our move to disrupt basic education as we go on to disrupt higher education.
Indeed. You mentioned a number of very valid points there, Professor Phakeng, and I'm keen for us to deep dive into them in just a moment. As you mentioned, multiple stakeholders have a keen interest into the role and function of education, not only now, but even in years that will go forward, because there is a primary objective to understand that education does not only have a significant role on society, but society itself is a key investment to economic development and the livelihoods and growth of individuals. But Professor Vilakazi, we've kept you quiet for too long. I'm keen to get your opening remarks on this before we do deep dive into some of those elements that have been mentioned by your peers and colleagues on this panel. But perhaps give us your context and understanding of the purpose, role and function of education in the 21st century, and of course also highlighting specific nuances that we need to be mindful of given the economic climate and geographic location that we're in here on the continent.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. Good morning to everybody. Given where we are now, I mean, we are halfway through the first half of the 21st century, right? And I mean, already kind of, I don't have the prescience to tell you what's going to happen in the third half of, or in the third quarter of the century. But what I can tell you with certainty is that in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll be disrupted by the exponential that you are living in. What do you mean by this exponential? The world is getting connected at neck break speed, and the power of the machines that are driving this great accelerator, driven by climate change, driven by rise in inequality, and driven by, you know, what people call the Moore's law, the power of computation, which is unleashing ubiquitous technologies that actually are beginning to change the way we live, interact, and work together. And these changes bring about endless cultural, social, and emotional disruptions, you know, that manifest themselves through mental wellness, which also has been a big issue, especially, and has been added on by the pandemic. Now, with all those components taken together, one has to think and project to the future that is unknown. I do believe, and other colleagues here have covered the ground, that education is not about content as well, right? I mean, content is part of it. Whether you talk about STEM or STEAM, I mean, I include the arts in the science, technology, and mathematical fields, but it is actually about inclusive learning. Yet at the same time, you know, we've spoken about interdisciplinarity, but you still need to value the role of specialists. You know, our treatment of the COVID pandemic relied on specialized knowledge. I think sometimes people talk about general education, multi, inter, and transdisciplinary as if it's the panacea to all our problems. I don't believe so, that you don't need age-old specialists. You still need, you know, a person that will do a job with high level of
Well, it seems as though we might be losing Professor Vilakazi there, but of course that's given the virtual age that we live in. Sometimes some gremlins do get into the system, but we will pick up on some of those nuances. And what I'm actually keen to do is to fully decipher and of course get some clarity on the personalization of education. We're well aware of the fact that the pandemic has really unearthed a lot more of the inequalities that we witness within society. And one thing that we are quite concerned about is that the African continent should not be a laggard to that of its global peers. And this is where, Professor Phakeng, I'd like to get your insight into, and perhaps Professor McIver, if you could also join in to give us your perspective here, primarily focused on the personalization of education and how that does translate into the African context, where we still need to industrialize, where we do need a form of economic contribution and participation to take place, but at the same time making sure that we leapfrog by being innovators and forming a generation of thinkers. Professor Phakeng, I'd like to start by getting your thoughts there. If you could keep it brief, and Professor McIver, if you could also add some of your thoughts into that particular context.
You know, I was hoping Professor McIver will talk to what he means by personalized education, because I want to talk about personalized learning and pacing within a classroom. I mean, and I think that's something that you can do much easier before you even get to the other one. Professor McIver?
Thank you very much, Professor. Okay, when I was talking about personalizing education, it's about giving the primary stakeholders more control over the direction and the paradigm of education. That's both in terms of the models that we employ and the subjects that we deliver, but in terms of content on an individual level as well. I think individual stakeholders should be included, and we talk about partnerships in learning, but quite often that partnership in learning doesn't extend to the content, it doesn't extend to the assessment, and it doesn't extend to the method of delivery. I would actually like to see that level of involvement. I would like to see students themselves talking about the content that they feel is relevant and appropriate to them. I'd like to see students themselves having discussions about the way in which that content is assessed. So when I talk about personalization, I'm referring to it in two levels. I'm talking about it in terms of the model itself and the primary stakeholders having a say in informing the shape of the model, but also at the micro level, individual learners themselves having a say and a control over the nature of their learning.
Professor McIver, if I can jump in there very briefly, is that a luxury we can afford on the African continent?
There is I will be honest, there is an element of Western elitism in relation to this. My position comes very much as an educationalist who was educated in the West. So in that respect, it may not be entirely practical, but from a theoretical point of view, I would argue that the model that is currently being applied in Africa and other countries and continents around the world is the Western model. And it is the Western model served the West very well for 300 years, but even now it is beginning to see signs of age.
Very valid point that you mentioned there. I would like to drop in Professor Phakeng to get some of her thoughts and insights, including your other two colleagues. So Professor Phakeng, perhaps if you can expand on the personalization pace that you had elaborated on, and maybe also reflect on how we can make this, I guess, these suggestions more unique in order to address the challenges on the continent.
I'm glad Professor McIver explained what he means. Almost the same thing, but your point exactly, very relevant, right? Truth be told, I mean, in traditional schools, teachers simply don't have the time or resources to slow down or speed up based on how a single student is progressing or check each one's context and draw on it. Everyone progresses at the same pace because that's what the schedule says. And those are the constraints, right, of the current models of teaching at basic and at higher education. And we are trying something else with our online high school. We're trying something else that we believe when you do this, digital resources actually allow us to do this. So on our online high school, which we're thinking, of course, as we think of the future, personalized pacing is one of the things that are key, right? What we do, we have our expert teachers and support coaches that help learners to decide what their day looks like, and no learner should ever be bored because they're spending hours sitting in class that have already mastered the topic that's been taught, and it becomes pointless. And no learner should ever get left behind, right? So we also give students an opportunity to say, well, I need extra tutoring in this subject concept in mathematics. Well, if you want to do that for the day, no problem, you go ahead. If you feel like working all day on mathematics project, you can do that, go for it. We encourage a personalized pace and balanced by a structured learning schedule, which is tailor-made for a student to help them target specific text and exam blocks. But of course, I'm sure I can imagine you saying, but how many learners in Africa are going to access this? Well, many. And this is the debate that people have thrown at me after we launched our online school. The pandemic showed us, I mean, actually it made irrelevant the question about who can go online, who can learn online, who can't. Because when the lockdown came, that was a non-issue. The issue was, how do we get them to do that? Now we are making these resources available. And so if any student who registers online can do this, and this is not the only thing that stands alone, because I mean, this is one of the aspects built in how we teach. And if you're teaching online, you can do this, but that doesn't mean the teacher is not there. There's a teacher and time to engage with the students and time, but the student designed this, and so they move at their own pace. Sure. And it's also based on the idea of a mastery-based learning, that you will not move to the next level until you master this topic. You don't move to the next, and that's important for many of the subjects, the STEAM subjects, right? If you don't know something, if you don't know fractions, algebra becomes difficult and calculus becomes unthinkable. So I'm saying this is here for Africa, for South Africa now, right? Indeed. And I'm saying to you, we are starting it now in January, and I want you to talk to me in June, and the platform is available for anyone, registered or not, but it is available now.
Professor Phakeng, we'll definitely make sure that we do touch base with you to continue to find out where that growth is coming from and what's been the key driver there. But I'm loving the passion that's coming through, because this does also help us to understand the various stakeholders that we need to speak to. We've understood that personalization and the slight move away from industrialization is quite key. We also understand that technology is a key enabler, not the panacea, in order to make sure that we can implement personalization pacing. But I'm also keen to understand some of the key conversations we need to have with industry, with business, with government, who hold the keys to policy, implementation, and of course the additional investment in terms of infrastructure and funding that needs to be allocated to educational institutions. And Professor Vilakazi, I'm aware that you had some feedback on the previous comment. Perhaps I can start with you by not only building up on your feedback there, but also addressing this conversation and question regarding the conversations that we have that need to be refreshed and renewed with the key stakeholders who also have a key interest in education. Professor Kunen, if you have some insight, we're happy to come to you too. Prof. Vilakazi?
Yeah, thank you. I hope that you were able to share the last portion of my presentation. But nonetheless, I just want to also add here, before I respond to your question, that, look, if you say that these problems are unique to South Africa, I think, yes, they are in Africa broadly. But I think as a universalist, that you've got common problems that enjoin us as the world. I think let's also not create a kind of African exceptionalism that these problems are only unique to Africa. I think we are connected in a way that has been shown by the pandemic and these ubiquitous technologies, that actually we are part of a global community. So therefore, there could be elements that can be bespoke to this continent, but by and large, we are, part of the global human family. And secondly, I want to just also pivot slightly on what Professor Mekiva said with regards to the personalized education. Yes, you can make education personalized to that particular individual, but as human beings, and I think despite where we are with technology, with cyber infrastructure, physical integration, we are after all humans. And I do believe that the strength of the education as well, in particular the higher education, is to create networks, human networks. You go to university to actually meet with people. So I think just pivoting fully towards online will destroy the very nature of what it means to be human. I mean, we are human because we live in a planet, in a global environment that requires us to connect, to argue, to actually engage and solve problems in a human way, in a biological way, not in a cyber way. So I think that's very, very important that whilst we talk about personalized education, we need to talk about socialized education as well. That's why I've got kids in the classroom. They're there to actually learn to resolve conflict from grade 0 to matric, to grade 12 or A levels. So that's very, very important. The stakeholders in that regard, obviously government, I mean, the private sector, and also we need to have that feedback loop between industry and educators. You know, whether we like it or not, that significant number of our students don't get educated for the sake of being educated. They want to be part of the future workforce whose jobs are being created. True. So therefore, how can we work with our, you know, our industrial and public and private partners to ensure that our education is not like stuck in Plato's cave, is actually relevant to the societal needs, whilst addressing some of the fundamental questions that lead society. We are not being led by society, we lead society. At some stage, we are led by our stakeholders. So it's almost like a feedback mechanism. That means that we dictate and we get dictated to by our stakeholders.
Indeed. And that's a valid point there, Professor Vilakazi, because it does build on a theme that Professor Kuhnen had touched on, that education is also meant to be an enabler to allow people to evolve, to transform. You might start off in academia, but work in industry at some point, and then move on to government policies at a greater level. And that's where I'm hoping to get to in terms of the kind of conversations that we all need to get into. And Professor Kuhnen, given the fact that you interact with a multitude of international counterparts reviewing education, we understand the insights that are developing in China at the moment, where government has put certain limitations on private tutoring to equal the level field when it comes to access to education. I'm keen to hear from you what your observations are, not only by taking a look at the global trends, but also understanding how these trends not only speak to each other as we are members of a global community, but some nuances that pop out from certain markets. Professor Kuhnen?
I mean, I think that one of the interesting things comes out of this year of COVID, where every university has had to look at how it delivers online, how it engages with students. And I think it comes back to something that the last speaker said, that one of the things that our students are saying is that they want to engage with people. They don't want to be in their room only. They want to be engaging with people. But there's another side to that. And that is that in part, there is less engagement in the education that we're delivering, not because of the technology, but because of the people who are designing what we're delivering in the technology. We are not 18-year-olds who are net natives, who are actively engaging in arguments, in discussions, in debates online every day. But when we design what we teach online, we don't do that because we're viewing the technology from people who are not net natives. We're all people who have come to the net late. And so in part, we need to be looking at, and this is a trend across the education sectors that I've been talking to, that people are saying, how do we find a different way of transforming what happens online so that it evens the playing field and allows for the kinds of discussions and debates? And this comes back to the fundamental question, in a sense, that was raised by both the first speaker and the last, which is, are we really going back to an education that's primarily about teaching people for the workforce, where industry plays the major role? If we are, we're missing the real direction of the future. The real direction of the future is allowing students to think about, what is it that I want to do in my next job, and the job after that, and the job after that? And then personalized education for me, and this is something where people are beginning in every sector to break down the boundaries of disciplines, the boundaries of degrees, and beginning to say, how do we look at what we're offering and allow students to design out of different building blocks the degrees that they need to do, not the degrees we think.
A very valid point there, Professor, and I'm keen to jump in there with a question that we have from one of our audience participants, which I think does help us get some context and understanding of the direction within which we need to move as we wrap up and conclude this conversation due to time pressures. Camilla Kirkwartz asks, is there a unified education model or definition that we can apply across the world, or do we need to think of regional adaptations? Professor McIver, I think I'm keen to get your thoughts on this one as we do conclude our panel discussion. And if there is time, Professor McIver, if you can keep it quite brief due to time pressures.
I will do my best to keep it brief. Personally, I believe we have to contextualize education. I don't think the one-size-fits-all works. And the point I was trying to make earlier on is the Western model worked well for the West for 300 years. Doesn't mean to say that it's the best model for Africa or Asia or for other continents, other communities. The other thing I would very quickly say is in terms of personalized education and the use of the digitalization, it isn't about removing the social context of learning. Digitalization actually increases the resources and the options that are available to students. So it increases the opportunity for personalized experience. I'm all in favor of the socialization and networking that takes place in universities.
Indeed. Well, a lot more themes that we can certainly explore. However, we are limited for time and there's lots more elements that we need to discuss. But we are incredibly appreciative of your time as well as the concepts and ideas that have been laid at the table going forward. This will be these themes will continue to be explored in the follow-up panel discussions, where we'll take a look at how continued learning can take place to allow for the advancement of individuals to exploit their full potential. We will also unpack how technology does play a role in the pace of personalization of technology, and of course understanding that whilst we need to strike a balance between individuals who evolve and create new careers for themselves, we also need to develop a pool of specialists within various sectors of the economy to make sure that they can adequately address the needs that we have in those zones. A great pleasure having all of you with us this afternoon, and thank you so much for your time. To Professor Zeblon Vilakazi, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, Professor Malcolm McIver, CEO and Provost of Lancaster University, Ghana, and Professor Seth Coonan, Deputy Vice-Chancellor International at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. We thank you so much for your time today and, of course, helping participate in molding and shaping the themes that come to mind when we think about the redefining of education in the 21st century.